October 1944. The war in the Pacific had entered its final and most brutal phase. After 3 years of relentless fighting across countless islands, the United States stood on the edge of victory, and Japan on the edge of defeat. Yet, one place still symbolized unfinished business: the Philippines. When Japan invaded the Philippines in 1942, the fall of the islands had shocked the world. More than 70,000 Allied soldiers were captured, and General Douglas MacArthur, commander of U.S. forces, was ordered to withdraw. Standing on the deck of a small patrol boat, he made a promise that echoed through history. "I shall return." By late 1944, that promise was about to be fulfilled. The United States had regained control of the Central Pacific. The Marianas, Palau, and the Solomons had fallen. American air power now reached deep into Japanese-held territory, and the once invincible Imperial Navy was bleeding. The plan to retake the Philippines, codenamed Operation King II, would be one of the largest amphibious operations in history. More than 700 ships and 200,000 troops gathered under the command of Admiral William F. Halsey and General MacArthur. Their goal: secure Leyte Island, the gateway to the Japanese homeland. Japan's leaders understood the stakes. If the Americans reclaimed the Philippines, Japan would be cut off from the vital oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Without fuel, its war machine would die. For Tokyo's high command, the upcoming battle was not just about territory, it was about survival. On October 17th, U.S. reconnaissance forces landed on small islands near Leyte Gulf, clearing coastal defenses. 3 days later, the main invasion began. As dawn broke on October 20th, the horizon filled with gray ships stretching as far as the eye could see. The most powerful fleet ever assembled in the Pacific. At 9 a.m., waves of amphibious craft headed for red and white beaches near Tacloban. Naval guns thundered behind them, pounding Japanese defenses inland. From the beach, palm trees burned, sand erupted, and smoke rolled across the bay. Despite the chaos, American troops pressed forward. At 1:30 p.m., MacArthur himself waded ashore through waist-deep water. Beside him were journalists and officers, cameras rolling as he made his way to land. Standing before the people of Leyte, he spoke the words that the world had waited to hear. "People of the Philippines, I have returned." For the people of the Philippines, his return was a moment of hope after years of darkness. For Japan, it was a signal that the tide of war had turned for good. Yet even as American flags rose on Leyte, a much greater battle was about to begin, one that would decide the fate of the Pacific itself. As American forces stormed the beaches of Leyte, far across the western Pacific, the Japanese High Command prepared its last great gamble, a desperate plan that they believed could change the course of the war. The operation was codenamed Shogo, or Operation Victory. But in truth, it was a plan born not of strength, but of desperation. Japan's navy was crippled, its fuel reserves nearly exhausted, and its aircraft losses catastrophic. Yet the commanders in Tokyo were unwilling to surrender the Pacific without one final decisive blow. The Japanese strategy was simple on paper and terrifying in execution. 3 separate naval forces would converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions, striking the American invasion fleet from the north, south, and west. The largest of these forces, known as the Center Force, was commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. His fleet included the most powerful battleships ever built, Yamato and Musashi, each armed with 18-inch guns capable of firing shells the size of small cars. To the south, Vice Admiral Nishimura led the Southern Force, a smaller but deadly formation intended to push through the narrow Surigao Strait. From the north came the Northern Decoy Force, commanded by Admiral Ozawa, made up mostly of empty aircraft carriers meant to lure Admiral Halsey's main fleet away from Leyte. The plan relied on deception. Ozawa's carriers would appear as the main threat, drawing the Americans northward, while Kurita's massive center force would break through from the west and annihilate the vulnerable landing forces at Leyte. But for this to succeed, every element had to work perfectly. The slightest failure, a mistimed attack, a wrong signal, or a broken communication line, could doom the entire operation. On October 22, 1944, the Japanese fleet began to move. From Brunei Bay, Kurita's battleships and cruisers steamed eastward through the Palawan Passage, a dangerous, narrow stretch of water filled with reefs and U.S. submarines. In the early hours of October 23rd, the submarines USS Dace and USS Darter detected Kurita's fleet on radar. Hidden beneath the waves, the American submariners prepared to strike. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was about to begin, not with planes or battleships, but with silent hunters in the deep. As dawn broke, the submarines attacked. Torpedoes raced through the water, striking the Japanese cruiser Atago, Kurita's flagship. Within minutes, the ship exploded and sank, taking over 300 men with it. Kurita barely escaped the inferno, rescued by a destroyer as his fleet scattered in confusion. Despite the loss, Kurita pressed on. His remaining ships regrouped and entered the Sibuyan Sea, where another, even greater test awaited. Overhead, American reconnaissance aircraft had spotted them, and soon waves of U.S. carrier planes were on their way. The first attack came just before noon. Dozens of Helldiver dive bombers and Avenger torpedo planes descended from the clouds, targeting the battleship Musashi. Anti-aircraft guns roared, filling the sky with flak and smoke. The battle had turned into a storm of steel. For hours, American pilots made run after run. Torpedoes slammed into Musashi's massive hull. Bombs tore open her decks. By sunset, the giant battleship was listing heavily, fires raging across her superstructure. At 7:30 p.m., she finally rolled over and sank, taking more than 1,000 sailors with her. Yet even as Musashi slipped beneath the waves, Kurita refused to turn back. He radioed Tokyo. "I will press forward." The Japanese fleet, bloodied but still dangerous, continued toward Leyte Gulf, unaware that the Americans believed the danger had already passed. To the north, Admiral Halsey spotted Ozawa's decoy carriers and took the bait, steering the U.S. Third Fleet away from the invasion beaches. The trap was working. The path to Leyte was open, and Kurita's center force was about to sail into history's largest naval battle. October 24, 1944, dawn over the Sibuyan Sea. The calm surface of the water reflected streaks of gold, masking the storm that was about to erupt. Far below the clouds, Admiral Kurita's center force, the most powerful fleet Japan had ever sent to battle, was pushing east toward the Philippines. The fleet stretched for miles. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, 23 vessels in total, their hulls cutting through the mist. At its heart sailed two monsters of steel, Yamato and Musashi. Each displaced more than 70,000 tons, armed with guns that could send a shell 25 miles through the air. Inside Musashi's engine room, the temperature climbed above 40 degrees. Grease-covered mechanics worked in silence as vibrations shook the deck. Above them, sailors stood ready at the anti-aircraft batteries. The morning sun glinted off the barrels as officers scanned the sky. At 8:10 a.m., a scout plane from the American carrier USS Intrepid spotted Kurita's force and sent a radio message back to Task Force 38. Enemy fleet sighted. Numerous battleships and cruisers, heading east through Sibuyan Sea. Within minutes, Admiral William Halsey and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher ordered every available aircraft to prepare for launch. The largest carrier strike in history was about to begin. On the flight decks of carriers Essex, Lexington, and Enterprise, crews worked at fever pitch. The air was thick with fuel vapor and the roar of engines. Pilots strapped in, faces set in determination. They knew the ships they were about to face were unlike any they had ever encountered. At 10:30 a.m., the first wave arrived. More than 50 planes, Helldiver dive bombers, Avengers loaded with torpedoes, and Hellcats providing cover. Above the clouds, the American formation dove into the attack. "This is Intrepid 1, commencing run on Battleship." From below, Japanese lookouts shouted warnings. "Enemy aircraft, high altitude." Portside, anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the sky with black puffs of shrapnel. The air crackled with tracer rounds as the first bombs fell. The American pilots aimed for the Musashi. Her massive hull made her an easy target, but her armor was nearly impenetrable. Bombs struck the decks, throwing geysers of water high into the air, but the giant refused to slow. Inside the bridge, the ship's captain, Vice Admiral Toshihira Inoguchi, remained calm, barking orders through the chaos. "Maintain heading. Damage control to port section. Keep firing." Fire teams rushed through smoke-filled corridors, sealing compartments, spraying foam on burning fuel. The crew fought not only the enemy, but their own ship's wounds. At noon, a second wave arrived. This time from USS Essex and USS Lexington. They came in lower, faster, torpedoes skimming across the water. Several struck Musashi's hull in rapid succession. The impact shook the sea. "We got hits! Multiple hits!" shouted one American pilot over the radio. From the sky, they could see the shock waves ripple through the battleship's wake. Musashi slowed to a crawl. At 1:30 p.m., a third wave came. The attacks were relentless. Each bomb, each torpedo, chipped away at the massive ship's strength. Still, Musashi's gunners kept firing, hitting several U.S. planes. Smoke rose thousands of feet into the air, visible from over 100 miles away. Inside Musashi, compartments flooded faster than they could be sealed. Power flickered, pumps failed. Men worked waist-deep in seawater, passing ammunition by hand as the ship began to list. Captain Inoguchi ordered non-essential crew to abandon ship, but many refused. "We will not leave our ship," one officer said quietly. "We will fight until the end." By late afternoon, after 17 bomb hits and 19 torpedo impacts, Musashi was mortally wounded. Her once mighty engines stopped. The lights flickered out. Slowly, she began to roll onto her port side. At 7:30 p.m., as the sun set over the Sibuyan Sea, the Musashi capsized and sank stern first, disappearing beneath the waves. Over 1,000 men went down with her. Captain Inoguchi was among them. As night fell, Kurita's fleet turned back, but only for a short time. After regrouping, the admiral decided to continue the advance toward Leyte. The Japanese trap had cost them dearly, but the battle was far from over. For the men aboard the American carriers, the day ended with a sense of triumph. They had destroyed one of the most powerful warships ever built. But in the dark waters below, the rest of Kurita's fleet was still moving, and the deadliest phase of the battle had yet to come. Dawn broke over the Philippine Sea on October 25, 1944. The sky was a pale gray, streaked with clouds, and the sea lay calm and silent. To the east of the island of Samar, a small American escort group known as Taffy 3 was preparing for another routine day of airstrikes in support of the Leyte landings. The men aboard these ships had little reason to expect danger. Their group consisted of 6 slow escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Ships designed for anti-submarine patrol, not fleet combat. Their aircraft were armed mostly for ground attack. Against battleships, they stood almost no chance. Unknown to them, however, Admiral Kurita's center force, after surviving the air assaults of the previous day, had passed through the San Bernardino Strait under cover of night. By sunrise, it was steaming directly toward Taffy 3's position. At 06:37 a.m., a lookout aboard the carrier USS Fanshawe Bay raised his binoculars and froze. Dark shapes were emerging from the morning mist on the northwestern horizon. Battleships and cruisers closing fast. The alarm was sounded. "Enemy fleet approaching from the northwest." Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, was momentarily stunned. The nearest friendly battleships were hundreds of miles away with Admiral Halsey. His tiny force would have to fight alone. Sprague immediately ordered, "Launch all planes! Repeat, launch all planes!" On the carrier decks, crews raced to start engines and roll aircraft forward. Pilots took off armed with whatever ordnance they had. Depth charges, machine gun ammo, or even empty racks. As one pilot later recalled, "We went up with whatever we could carry. Some of us had nothing but small arms fire." Within minutes, the Japanese opened fire. Salvos of 18-inch and 8-inch shells thundered across the sea. Huge columns of water erupted around the escort carriers. Shell splinters clattered across decks as the small American ships began laying smoke screens to hide themselves. At 07:02 a.m., Commander Ernest E. Evans of the destroyer USS Johnston gave an order that would become legend. "Commence attack! All engines ahead flank!" The destroyer turned toward the Japanese fleet, alone, firing its guns as it closed the range for a torpedo strike. The Johnston raced through the smoke at over 30 knots. Shells splashed around it, but Evans held course. At 9,000 yards, he fired 10 torpedoes at the cruiser Kumano. Moments later, a huge explosion ripped through the enemy ship's bow, forcing it out of action. Inspired by Evans, the destroyers Hole and Heermann also charged. Their torpedoes and gunfire confused the Japanese formation, forcing battleships to turn away. For nearly an hour, these three small ships fought an enemy more than 10 times their size. Overhead, aircraft from the escort carriers joined the fight. Pilots dove through anti-aircraft fire, dropping depth charges and strafing gun crews. When their ammunition ran out, some made dummy attack runs to draw fire away from the ships below. At 07:30, the carrier Gambier Bay was hit repeatedly by 8-inch shells from the cruiser Chikuma. Fires spread across her deck as the ship began to slow. Crewmen fought to contain the flames, but by 09:07 she rolled onto her side and sank. More than 130 men were lost. Johnston, hit dozens of times, was also sinking. Her guns kept firing until the very end. Captain Evans was last seen on the fantail, giving orders to abandon ship. He went down with his crew. He would later be awarded the Medal of Honor. Despite the losses, the ferocity of Taffy III's defense convinced Admiral Kurita that he was facing a much larger force. Fearing an ambush by American battleships, he ordered his ships to break off the attack and withdraw northward. At 09:20 a.m., the Japanese guns fell silent. Smoke drifted across the sea as the remaining American carriers and escorts regrouped to pick up survivors. The battle had lasted barely 3 hours, but in that short time, a handful of small ships and air crews had turned back an entire fleet. In his after-action report, Admiral Sprague wrote, "The courage, skill, and determination of our men cannot be overstated. They did all that could be done, and more." The battle off Samar would stand as one of the most extraordinary engagements in naval history. A triumph of bravery and confusion, of human resolve against overwhelming odds. As the sun rose higher over the Pacific, the remnants of both fleets drifted apart, leaving the sea littered with smoke, oil, and memory. The echoes of battle still drifted over the Philippine Sea as the surviving ships of Admiral Kurita's center force turned northward. The once mighty fleet, which only hours earlier had threatened to annihilate the American landing force at Leyte, was now a broken and disordered armada. The decks of the battleships Yamato, Nagato, and Congo were scarred by bomb splinters. Several cruisers trailed smoke and oil. On every ship, men worked silently to plug holes, fight fires, and tend to the wounded. The sea was calm again, but the silence was heavy, the kind that comes after fury. On the bridge of Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, Admiral Takeo Kurita stood near the chart table, staring at the compass repeater. He had spent 3 days under relentless air attack, watched several of his ships sink, and fought an unexpected battle against an enemy that should never have been there. To his officers, he said little. No one spoke of victory. Instead, The talk was of losses. Musashi gone, Chikuma lost, Suzuya exploding after near misses, and hundreds of men missing or dead. The pride of the Imperial Navy was fading into exhaustion. Reports filtered in from scattered ships. Radio circuits were jammed, some antennas destroyed. The fleet was no longer coordinated. The heavy cruiser Kumano had been forced to withdraw earlier with her bow blown off. The Chokai was still burning and lagging behind. Kurita's staff officers struggled to make sense of the chaos. It was clear that the element of surprise, their greatest advantage, was gone. Every minute spent lingering near Samar risked another American airstrike. In his cabin, Kurita reviewed his orders. His mission, issued directly from Tokyo, was to attack the Allied landing forces in Leyte Gulf and destroy their transports. But the charts told a grim truth. His ships were low on ammunition and fuel. Half his cruisers were damaged, and his battleships were short of shells. He could continue south, but to do so would invite annihilation from carrier aircraft by morning. The alternative, retreating, would mean abandoning the mission and facing the wrath of the Imperial General Staff. It was a choice between honor and survival. By mid-morning, word reached him of the Southern Forces' destruction in Surigao Strait. Admiral Nishimura's ships, including the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, had been wiped out by American torpedoes and crossfire. The combined fleet, once the pride of Japan, was shattered across the Philippines. Even if Kurita pressed on, there would be no support, no rescue, and no fuel to return. The sea had become an open graveyard for battleships. On the horizon, American carrier aircraft reappeared. Small formations of Avengers and Helldivers, returning from earlier sorties, began to circle. Though low on fuel, they dove again at the retreating ships. Bombs splashed nearby, tracer fire laced the sky, and damaged cruisers turned sharply to avoid hits. Each attack deepened the conviction aboard the Japanese flagship. The Americans owned the air, and without air cover, survival was luck, not strategy. Shortly after 11 a.m., Kurita gave the order few expected to hear. Cease action. Turn north. Regroup. The helmsman acknowledged the command, and one by one, the ships came about. Officers on the decks of the battleships looked back toward the south, toward Leyte, where smoke still rose from the distant horizon. None of them spoke. They knew the battle, and perhaps the war, had turned irrevocably against them. The retreat through the San Bernardino Strait was somber and silent. The same channel that had carried the fleet into battle now carried them home in defeat. Wounded sailors lay in makeshift infirmaries. Gunners stood at their posts, watching the empty sky. The engines droned, the metal bulkheads groaned, and the once proud fleet sailed in fragments. Some ships had lost power entirely and were being towed. Others listed heavily from internal flooding. Every mile north felt longer than the one before. In Tokyo, radio operators received the first fragmentary messages. Enemy transport fleet not attacked. Heavy losses sustained. Silence followed. When the meaning sank in, it struck like a physical blow. The last major surface fleet Japan could field had failed to achieve its objective. The Imperial Navy, once master of the Pacific, would never again mount an offensive operation. Aboard Yamato, the admiral remained alone on the bridge, staring into the wind. Those who saw him later remembered his quiet composure. "I did all I could," he reportedly said to his staff. It was not self-pity, only acceptance. Below deck, sailors prayed, wrote final letters, and tended to their comrades. For the first time, they began to speak openly of home, of families they hadn't seen in years, and of the sea that had become their world. By sunset, the fleet was clear of the strait. The horizon glowed red with the last light of day, reflecting off the battered hulls. The ocean was strangely calm, as if the war itself had paused to take breath. Somewhere far to the east, American search planes still circled, their engines faint but ever present. On the flagship, lights were dimmed and silence settled once more. The war was far from over, but for the men of the center force, the battle was finished. In the months that followed, Japan's navy would never recover. Fuel shortages, air losses, and the steady advance of Allied forces would confine the remaining ships to port. Less than a year later, Yamato herself would sail on her final mission, one that would end in flames off Okinawa. The retreat from Leyte was more than a withdrawal. It was the end of an era, the moment when the sea, once dominated by battleships, was claimed forever by the air. By April 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final and most desperate stage. Japan, once the master of the Pacific, was now surrounded by Allied forces on all sides. Entire cities had been flattened by relentless bombing campaigns. Oil reserves were nearly gone. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once feared for its power and precision, was reduced to a handful of surviving ships, hiding in scattered ports. Yet among those ships stood one final symbol of might and pride: the Yamato. At 72,000 tons, she was the largest and most heavily armed battleship ever built. Her 9 18.1-inch guns capable of firing shells the size of small cars. To her crew, Yamato was not just a ship. She was the soul of the Navy, a monument to Japan's industrial power and warrior spirit. But by 1945, the age of the battleship was over. Airplanes ruled the seas, and Yamato's massive guns could do little against enemies she could barely see. When American forces landed on Okinawa in early April, it became clear to Japan's leaders that the war was nearing its end. The fall of Okinawa would open the path to the Japanese mainland. The Navy's high command proposed a desperate final act, Operation 10 Go. Yamato and a small escort of 1 light cruiser and 8 destroyers would sail south toward Okinawa. There, she would intentionally beach herself and fight until destroyed, serving as a giant gun platform to defend the island's defenders. It was, in every sense, a suicide mission. There was no plan for return, no refueling points, and no air cover. Even Admiral Seiichi Ito, who commanded the task force, opposed the operation, calling it a waste of lives. But the spirit of sacrifice had overtaken reason. To the Japanese military, dying in battle was still seen as honorable, far more acceptable than surrender. On April 6, 1945, the crew of Yamato assembled on deck as orders were read aloud. The message was simple, almost poetic in its finality. You are to proceed to Okinawa, attack the enemy fleet, and fight to the end. A solemn silence fell across the ship. The men understood immediately what it meant. None of them would see home again. Below decks, letters were written to mothers, wives, and children, sealed carefully in metal boxes or burned to prevent capture. In the mess halls, cooks prepared what would be their last proper meal: rice, pickled vegetables, and a single slice of fish per man. Some sailors polished their uniforms and boots. Others stood quietly on deck, staring at the dark water. Captain Ariga Kosaku, Yamato's commanding officer, walked through the ship, speaking softly to his crew. "Let us die bravely," he told them. "Let us die for Japan." At precisely 3:20 p.m., Yamato raised anchor and began her final journey. Her great propellers churned the calm waters of Tokuyama Bay as the escorting destroyers formed a protective ring around her. Civilians gathered on nearby hills to watch the giant ship move out, some waving flags, others standing in silence. They all knew they were watching something historic, perhaps even sacred. The battleship's deep horn echoed across the harbor, its sound rolling through the valleys like a farewell. As she entered the open sea, her crew stood at attention on deck, facing the homeland they would never return to. Many whispered prayers. Others simply closed their eyes and let the wind hit their faces. Behind her, a trail of black smoke stretched for miles, a long, fading line drawn across the waters of a dying empire. By dawn on April 7th, Yamato's fate had already been sealed. American reconnaissance planes from Task Force 58, the most powerful carrier group in the Pacific, had sighted the Japanese formation the evening before. The information was quickly relayed to Admiral Mark Mitcher, who wasted no time. By morning, over 380 aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters were assembled on carrier decks, engines roaring and propellers whirring in unison. Their orders were clear: destroy Yamato before she could reach Okinawa. On board the battleship, radar operators began detecting faint blips on their screens around 10:01 a.m. The crew went to battle stations. Klaxons screamed through the corridors, hatches slammed shut, and gunners loaded their weapons. The ship's air defense batteries, over 150 guns of varying caliber, began to track the distant noise of engines. At 12:20 p.m., the horizon erupted with movement. Dozens of American aircraft appeared, first as glints of sunlight, then as dark shapes diving fast toward the fleet. Yamato's guns opened fire, shaking the ship with each thunderous burst. Shell casings clattered on the deck. Tracer rounds streaked across the sky in glowing arcs. For a moment, it seemed possible she might fight them off. One Avenger exploded in midair, its flaming wreckage plunging into the sea. Another was shredded by anti-aircraft fire. But for every plane that fell, 10 more took its place. Bombs began to rain down. One struck near the aft turret, blasting open the deck. Another hit amidships, tearing through armor plating and setting fuel stores ablaze. Crewmen were thrown from their posts. Smoke and fire rolled through passageways. Still, the gunners kept firing, blinded and deafened by their own weapons. Just as damage control teams began to contain the fires, a second wave of attackers arrived, torpedo bombers flying low over the waves. They approached from both sides, releasing their weapons in perfect timing. The sea erupted in geysers of white water as torpedoes slammed into Yamato's hull. 6 hit her port side almost simultaneously, flooding entire compartments. The ship listed hard to port, her decks tilting dangerously. Engineers in the lower decks fought to counter-flood starboard tanks. But the rate of flooding was unstoppable. Steam hissed from broken pipes. Electrical systems failed. Ammunition stores caught fire. In the boiler rooms, men remained at their stations even as water rushed in, shouting final prayers as the lights flickered out. On the bridge, Admiral Ito stood firm, refusing to abandon command. His calmness inspired everyone still alive to fight until the end. By 1:30 p.m., Yamato was dying. Flames engulfed the upper decks, ammunition cooked off in violent bursts, and the ship's massive guns hung silent, their crews dead or trapped. A single bomb, perhaps the cruelest of all, struck near the forward magazines. The resulting explosion tore through the ship with unimaginable force. Witnesses from the attacking aircraft described a blinding flash followed by a vast column of smoke that rose over 6,000 meters into the air. The entire midsection of the battleship disintegrated. From miles away, pilots could see a black mushroom cloud towering above the ocean. Within moments, Yamato broke apart, her bow and stern rising briefly before sliding beneath the waves. Over 3,000 men perished with her. The sea was covered in debris, twisted metal, life jackets, oil, and human remains. It was over in less than 2 hours. In the aftermath, the American pilots circled once more to confirm their victory. Below them, the sea burned in patches of oil and flame. The surviving destroyers, heavily damaged themselves, began rescuing whoever they could. Bodies floated among the wreckage, sailors clinging to pieces of wood, calling faintly for help. Some were pulled aboard. Others simply disappeared beneath the waves. Out of Yamato's crew of 3,056, only 276 survived. The light cruiser Yahagi and 4 destroyers were also lost. The Americans had destroyed Japan's final hope of a naval counterattack, yet even among the victors, the scene left many uneasy. One U.S. pilot later wrote in his diary, "It felt like killing something ancient, something that shouldn't die." The mightiest battleship in history had gone down, Not in a duel, but under a storm of metal from the sky. News of the disaster was kept secret in Japan. Newspapers were forbidden to mention it. Only months later, after the war's end, did the public learn that Yamato, the symbol of Japan's pride, was gone. Her loss marked not just the end of the Imperial Navy's power, but the death of an entire era of warfare. The age of the battleship had ended forever. In its place, the aircraft carrier reigned supreme. To the Japanese, Yamato's sacrifice came to represent both tragedy and duty, a reminder of devotion carried to its fatal extreme. To the Americans, it was a final confirmation that air power had changed the world. To history, it became one of the most haunting moments of the Pacific War, the day when courage met inevitability. Today, the wreck of Yamato lies quietly on the seabed, 340 kilometers southwest of Kyushu. Discovered by researchers in 1985, her remains are scattered across an area nearly a kilometer wide, a field of twisted steel and shattered guns. Divers who have visited describe an overwhelming sense of stillness. Light filters down through the water, illuminating the great hull that once shook the oceans. On the sea floor, nameplates, dishes, and shoes still rest where they fell. In Japan, memorials honor her crew every year on April 7th. To many, Yamato's final voyage is not just a story of war, but of humanity, of men who faced certain death with dignity, aboard a ship that became both their weapon and their grave. Above, the Pacific rolls endlessly, indifferent yet eternal, carrying the memory of those who vanished beneath its waves.